So I'll walk you through the well-architected framework today. What the well-architected framework is all about, followed by the AWS well-architected framework and the Azure well-architected framework, mostly ending with the comparison between, as per my opinion. So if you look at what is a well-architected framework, more or less all the cloud vendors now have the framework around these 5 pillars. Um, Both Azure and Amazon does use the same naming conventions, whereas Google has not 5 but 4 pillars. But the framework is mostly all about the key concepts, design principles, and architectural best practices that is available for designing or running or improving the quality of any workload in the cloud. So when can we use this framework? Of course, it can be used even before you are actually running your workloads on the mm, cloud. That means you have an on-premises environment and you are looking to adopt the cloud. So you can definitely use this. And of course, when you're running your workloads on the cloud already, you can use it to improve, assess and improve. And then if you want to optimize as well. And then what value does a well-architected has in a cloud environment? So if you look at the cloud, we know that it gives us a lot of opportunities to move faster. Uh, and the technology is innovating on the cloud. So, in a first approach, so the well-architected review gives us the opportunity to innovate using the best practices, and obviously how we can go faster to the time to market, to the first time to market, faster time to market. And then, of course, more importantly, to understand the potential impact, because more or less all the workloads that are on the cloud starts with an idea and ends up running in production, and you will definitely miss the opportunity to identify the potential impact and get into crisis. And so this well-architected framework and the review both helps to assess and understand that. Then, of course, you can use this as a consistent approach for moving ahead, either for moving more production workloads or optimizing an existing workload. And then you can use it to lower and mitigate risks. You can identify and then mitigate the risk, both on the security and the cost as well. And of course, the visibility of the risk and a compliance perspective. The transparency is there across the organization. So, being as an operating team or as an operations team, you can be very transparent. And as presented, what is a well-architected review is. So the review itself is a online tool, mostly free of use, both by Azure and Amazon. It's conducted through workshops. It has both business and technical objectives to understand the processes and the architecture best practices used for that workload. And of course, the workload is defined, and this review is not necessarily scoped for your entire environment as such. That becomes a too big an assessment or review, right? So it is scoped around a workload, which you can define on your three-tier model or as a front-end application that consists of a middle tier and database in the backend. Um, or it could be your backend application that is catering to your organizational requirements. But you define a workload and then you do the review. The deliverable itself is obviously a prescriptive changes that can be made to mitigate the risk and improve the workload architecture. Now we look at the AWS, the Amazon Web Services well-architected framework first. The background is this well-architected framework initially was like a white paper, which was designed firstly for the AWS internal use back in 2012. And this is scoped mm, for the roles of the CTOs or the architects or the developers, including the operational teams. But back in 2015, they did publish the framework publicly available. But in the reInvent 2018, they introduced the tool, the review tool. And since then, every year they have been introducing a revised version. And they are introducing more questions and also the lenses. The terminology lenses are used by Amazon, which covers different like um, serverless or for ISVs based on what are you running on the cloud. And of course, as mentioned, it is not an audit. Most of the times when we talk about a well-architected review, the operations teams take it back. They think that external parties are actually going to audit them. No, it is not an audit on their work. It is the review of the architecture. As we all know, the cloud is innovating so fast. The technology keeps changing, and this gives us an opportunity to assess how are we matching to the existing best practices and how can we improve and adapt. Um, what Amazon does is since it has been introduced for so long and it has so many iterations, it has a very structured approach to their architecture framework. And they start with giving us the general design principles, more or less focusing on the architecture and how the cloud provides you the different opportunities. So they, in general, they say, please stop kissing your capacity and use data-driven architectures and automate wherever possible. And more importantly, improve through game days. It's a terminology used in Amazon, as we know. It's basically like similar to like disaster recovery scenarios, which you would do on on-premises services, where you try to identify if if something goes wrong in your architecture, how do you basically get out of these scenarios, right? And also to identify opportunities to improve. Then they have the five pillars. Um, this is more or less um, similar to the Azure's as well, the naming convention. But of course, this is the standard naming convention. This is the sequence of the five pillars actually when you want to assess. So Amazon treats that the operational excellence should be your priority first. Of course, you can change the priority during the workshops because it is a review either that can be done by individual users or the teams themselves, but also through a partner using the Amazon Partner Network. A partner can do this review with the customer. So These are the five pillars, and the operational excellence is more or less focused on the operations, to how to assess and improve the procedures and processes, whereas the security helps to identify the risks and the integrity of the data, including the confidentiality and control, and also use the existing services that are provided by Amazon to control your posture of your environment, right? And then comes the reliability. Of course, this is to ensure that you can recover and can handle change. So this is the pillar that has the best practices that help you define your architecture, and then followed by performance efficiency. This is again to make informed decisions to maintain efficiency based on the business evolution, right? So whether you have a peak in the business or if um, you are running some heavy jobs, planned or unplanned, so how does the performance is taken care? Fall in the end, you have the cost optimization. I know most of the organizations, they believe cost is the primary goal, right? But Amazon thinks the trade-off should be, as in, depends how big your organization is. When you focus mostly on the cost, then all the other four pillars will be impacted. So if you focus only on security, for example, you may end up using services that will impact the cost. So you need to do a trade-off between the other pillars and then look at how the cost is optimized. Apart from that, of course, it will give you an opportunity to analyze the spendings and meeting the business needs without overspending. So I'm going through the pillars quickly. Apart from the general design principles, Amazon's well-architected framework and review has design principles for each pillar. So the operational excellence looks at the performing operations as a code, and how your procedures, runbooks or playbooks are defined, and how can you make changes frequently, and small and reversible changes. The questionnaire itself, I have a demo in the end, but a quick demo. But if you look at after the design principles, you go on to the best practice areas. So the questions are mm, focused on the best practice areas on each pillar. Now you see an examples here. They basically discuss how do you determine what your priorities as an organizations are, and how do you define your workload state. Basically, having a manual process for anything is cumbersome and complications. So they recommend to use automated processes, and you do changes and operate successfully and monitor your KPIs and make use of CI/CD and implement infrastructure as a code. So this pillar focuses on these areas, and then it gives you recommendations which can be picked up to improve your operations. Then is the security pillar. It has 7 design principles, more or less focused on the identity. As we all know, the identity is the new perimeter, unlike the network, which used to be on the on-prem. And it focuses on the logging and also applying security at all layers. We all know that we can use security in depth, where not only protecting your virtual machines or your code, just using the network or the network security groups, for example, are the security groups. Instead, you can actually use the built-in or native services that Amazon provides, um, that will help you to stop or detect the traffic level or the network level, the vulnerabilities even before reaching your environment. It involves the encryption, data protection in transit, and how do you prepare for security events. Has the best practice areas that is focused on the identity. So it talks about how you manage permissions for people, and then how you enable logging. So what it does is, of course, it gives you improvement plan, and it will help you to identify and implement the recommendations and enabling the logging and everything. But as I mentioned, every action you do here has a cost implication. So you need to do the trade-off across. Um, Moving on, it's a reliability pillar. It has five design principles. Again, the focus is on how you can recover from failure and how are you testing your procedures. As the cloud gives you enough, they say unlimited capacity on any front, right? So, but how would you use it, keeping cost in mind? So these are the KPIs this reliability pillar focuses on. And the best practice areas covers how are you actually architecting for failure, your network topology, um, and then the change management, how are you implementing changes both for the application and the infrastructure, and of course the failure management, mm, for the backups, right? You should have a backup based process, and you should have restore processes to test if the backups are running properly or not. Based on these questions, you get an improvement plan, of course. You have the performance efficiency pillar, which has five design principles. This talks about making use of serverless as much as possible, because then you are not actually guessing the capacity and the performance criteria. You leave it to Amazon, who should possibly maintain the infrastructure for that service to scale as much as want, right? And this topic mostly is focused on making use of cloud native services instead of running IaaS services, um, because then you are offloading the performance efficiency to the AWS. It focuses on the practice areas, on how are you actually selecting the workloads, either it be compute, storage, database, and how are you actually reviewing the new technologies. Because as I said, the cloud is innovating and Amazon keep introducing new services, and you may be doing using a service whatever was applicable or newly available in a year ago, but a new service comes up. How are you actually making use of it? So, and of course, it in talks about monitoring. How are you monitoring and alerting so you can looking after your performance efficiency? In the end, and the cost optimization pillar has five design principles. It talks about your overall efficiency, consumption model, and of course, understanding where money is being spent. And this has uh, knowledge on the tools that are available on Amazon, how you monitor the usage and cost using the Cost Explorer, the reports available, and of course, evaluating the cost when you are selecting services, and how are you optimizing over time. Because for example, the new latest version of the EC2 machines on base, right? So both the cost and the performance. So if you are using EC2 virtual machines, so how can you actually make use of the new models and save costs, etc. And also making use of the AWS budget, and how can you make use of the pricing model what Amazon provides, and the on-demand versus savings plans and reserve instances. We have seen during the reviews that most of the customers may be using reserve instances as a best practice, but as we know, there are limitations on the reserve instances. So you can not change across the model and the family of the CPU of the EC2, for example. But the savings plan was introduced, and it has the more mm, more capacity and the capability, compatibility to move across the family and CPU groups. I'll just quickly show you the how the Amazon electric framework looks like. So if you say um, you basically create a workload, as I mentioned, you define a workload, you give it a name and define which regions it is running, and you can also give the account IDs, and you can choose some optional options, and then you get to create a workload which basically has 52 questions based on the pillars, and it will give you, you can actually change the pillar priority here, whichever you want, though they say operational excellence is the first based on the customers. And once the review is done, you get a score card on how many are high risk areas and medium risk areas, and it will give you an improvement plan on each of the pillars. And then the best part is you can actually generate this as a report into a PDF that gives you each questionnaire on what options you had chosen and more descriptions. And every improvement plan has a link and explanation showing on what to do here. And the next, right, it will give you more detailed links that will help you to identify what needs to be done and can be implemented. So I don't have a lot of time to go more into the demo, but I just wanted to show you how the tool looks like and the questionnaires, right? Moving on, we are going into the Azure Well Architecture framework now. The background is that it was introduced in July 2020, and Azure Well Architecture, you had Azure Advisor earlier, but that is also now aligned with the Azure Well Architected framework that can actually identify and prioritize opportunities for the workloads. And though Azure Well Architected framework is aimed largely at new users for the new applications, but of course, it is recommended to be used at any stage of the cloud adoption. The review assessment is similar to Amazon's multiple choice quiz, and it has a score from 1 to 100, and you can actually extract that report and plan for the remediation as well. And the value again of the running the well architecture for this is you can improve most of this, and Azure focuses fairly on the cost and the first um, pillar, which is managing your budgets, then focuses on the security and how you can respond, and also on the operational processes and how can you improve your efficiency. So when do you think about getting well architected? As I mentioned, is it when you are designing or deploying new workloads? You can use the framework, which will give you the well architecture framework and the documentation and the architecture available. Or you can use to optimize an existing workload. So the Azure well architected framework also has the 5 pillars that gives you the same best practices that can be used to improve your cloud solution. The naming convention is similar to what Amazon has, but the design principles or the guidance is more or less different. They focuses more on the cost optimization, as I mentioned, on the first pillar, followed by operational excellence. And in the review itself, you cannot change the sequence, but you can choose what you want to do it instead of choosing all of them and do the monitoring and do the review itself. Introducing the pillars here, unlike the Amazons, which is a structured approach, Azure uses a more fluent approach. They introduce the best practices straight away on the documentation perspective, right? So on the cost optimization, it basically focusing on understanding and forecasting your costs, followed by how can you optimize your workloads for cost and how can you control your costs. So it introduces a lot of tools. As you see here, it has cost management, TCO calculator, and pricing for understanding and for optimizing. And it recommends to use Azure Advisor and also make use of Azure Hybrid Benefit and reservations. For the controlling of the costs, of course, you can use Azure policies because, as you know, you can not control stopping developers or the operations team to deploy services what they need. It would has implications on the cost. So you can use the Azure policies to define what can be created or what can be used and what are denied. Similarly, you have performance efficiency pillar. The This focuses on the responses to performance issues, how you monitor, how you automate, uh, and then on the service execution, how can you scale up based on the demand or any fault, and also how do you define the cost efficiency, uh, keeping the performance in mind. The operational excellence pillar, similar to the Amazons, it focuses on the processes, on the monitoring, more or less focusing on the continuous improvement using the automation as much as possible. The reliability pillar is again is focusing on how can you recover from pillars, similar to the Amazon and the idea, the design principles, and you're more or less using Azure own services to accomplish this. Security pillar, of course, focuses on how you build your foundation and how can you stay secure and how do you respond to threats. So This pillar basically focuses on the processes and the monitoring and the improvement that basically can be used to mitigate risk and improve environment consistency. Security focused and should be focused from the start, from the build itself, and should be embedded into the fundamental infrastructure. So you can basically have your monitoring as that can be detected and actioned upon. So this security pillar gives you the best practices to achieve that. Here, I'm just listing out few of the uh, inhibitors found during the reviews. This is just a sample list, right? Um, for example, in the reliability, we found that there is no support for disaster recovery because that was not thought about, or whatever is um, in place is doesn't actually cover this. Similarly, there is no visibility on root cause events, and you have no design for scaling, no security threat detection mechanism, or most of the times on the cost you have unclear or underused or outfund resources which are not accounted for. Just to show you how does the Azure well-architected review looks like. It is just an assessment tool. As I mentioned, you can actually choose your interest, and every pillar has a questionnaire, and each questionnaire has multiple choice question. We basically sit and define, and you choose what is applicable to your environment. If it is a new um, adoption, or you are already running production workloads, then you choose what is in place, the current setup, and then the end product will assess and give you a improvement plan. So once the review is done, you basically have, this is of course a bad example. It will give you a score out of 100. How do you, it looks like. And then the challenge here is that it will not give you a report in a PDF that is presentable to the organization management, but it gives you an export to the CSV with all of these checks. But it also gives you an online based recommendations on the improvement plan, where you can actually click on each one of them. It has links and documents that takes you to the Azure Architecture Center, and will has links and documents that can be used to improve those. Just show, this is the Microsoft Azure Director Framework documentation. It is available and it gives you links and documents. This is an example. So just in the end, just to give you mm, the comparison between AWS and Azure, as I mentioned, the main thing you would notice is that since Amazon has introduced this many years ago, they've had many iterations and they have evolved good. And Azure is moving on. Recently, they introduced in 2020, and they are working with partners as well, doing pilots and see how can the partner networks can do it. But as of now, it is just available online, and the individual users can just use this tool to do the assessment. So mm Amazon has a more structured approach, which has design principles in general, and then the best area that can be focused on each pillar. Whereas Azure, as I mentioned, has a fluent approach. It just presents the topics and the focus on each pillar. Amazon emphasizes on the importance of principles and practices apart from the technical knowledge, whereas Azure has more technical content in the framework and the review, and includes the framework also includes links to sample code that can be used for hands-on. Amazon has a well-architected partner program. You actually can get a badge. Like Amazon has advanced consulting partner, and like that, you also have a well-architected partner. So that means that it has a criteria that as a partner you need to be aligned with, and you get trained, and you need to have some required certifications for the people who are required to be doing this reviews, and you have boot camps and workshops that enable. And Amazon believes, since it has introduced this earlier, that when the customer does this reviews themselves, or Amazon does this review themselves, the success rate is very little to get the improvements done. Of course, the review gets done, but the improvement plan doesn't move on, because when you look at your assessment, you know what your status is, but you are actually either busy running your business workloads, or you don't have enough workforce to do the mitigations themselves. So Amazon focuses morely on the partners because they have close to 70 plus success rate when they use partners to do this. So that is why they actually have a funding program. That means the partners can request for funding when they are doing this review. Uh, as of now, it is about $5,000. And this review can be done through a workload. And it doesn't mean that for the entire environment, you get only the $5,000. And now this $5,000 is basically to the partner to do the review, to use their consultancy. So that gives a motivation to the partner. And for the customer, it is the credits, right? So the same $5,000 credits helps that you are doing it for free. You are actually not paying the partner to do the review and the mitigation as well. Um, and the assessment reporting, as I mentioned, is very streamlined. It gives a PDF document that can be used to the management and the Amazon. On Azure, as of now, there is no partner program yet, but it is in the roadmap, and there is study material available in Microsoft Learn, and videos are available as well. And they are doing pilots as of now in the partner enablement and see how they can have some badge as well from their side, certification that can have partners do this reviews. So Knowit, as we know, we have an offering already available that we can do the Azure well-architected review as a partner. So we are one of the forefront pilots which we are doing these reviews. As of now, the report is only on a CSV automatically that is generated from the Azure side, but I hope this gets more streamlined, because you have around 60 questions, and all of those questions with each topic into an Excel sheet becomes a huge document, and yeah, it doesn't look good. So that all I've tried to cover on a high level. What is the well-architected framework and how Amazon and Azure has evolved. I will leave the floor for any question and answers, please.